So, back in 2011, after 6 long years since A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons was released, and fans quickly consumed the new book. However, about halfway through A Dance with Dragons, readers came to a doozy of a chapter, Bran 3. After years of wondering where Bran's visions were coming from and who the mysterious Three-Eyed Crow was, it was revealed that, well, he was a 125-year-old one-eyed albino stuck in a tree that was actually a dream-sending hive mind depository of dead elf-like people, and the whole thing was metaphorically heaven. Ah, George R.R. Martin. Now, I was lurking on the internet back then, and surprisingly, the fandom was not too hung up on the weird old man in a tree thing. No, the fandom was too busy talking about Jon being the super-duper chosen one, and so not too much of anything else was really discussed. It's pretty much why I started my channel. However, I do remember one aspect of Bran 3 causing some ire, and that was the time travel. Now, I know for many at this point it's tough to remember the first time reading the series, but my experience was reading about some foreboding ice zombies in the prologue of A Game of Thrones, and then wondering when the characters were going to get together to deal with them. We got Ned sleuthing and Catelyn diplomating and Jon Snow cunninging and Aeron CPRing and Tyrion sivassing, but almost no movement on the ice zombie plot. No, the story of A Song of Ice and Fire has ballooned and ballooned, and so it was a bit jarring that after so much time, our author decided to plop time travel into the middle of the story. In fact, in Bran 3, Bran time travels and interacts with the past twice. The first time is when Bloodraven instructs him to join the weirwood. Bran closed his eyes and slipped free of his skin. Into the roots, he thought. Into the weirwood. Become the tree. For an instant, he could see the cavern and its black mantle, could hear the river rushing by below. Then, all at once, he was back home again. Lord Eddard Stark sat upon a rock beside the deep black pool in the godswood, the pale roots of the heart tree twisting around him like an old man's gnarled arms. The great sword Ice lay across Lord Eddard's lap, and he was cleaning the blade with an oilcloth. "Winterfell," Bran whispered. His father looked up. "Who's there?" he asked, turning. And Bran, frightened, pulled away. His father and the black pool and the godswood faded and were gone, and he was back in the cavern, the pale thick roots of his weirwood throne cradling his limbs as a mother does a child. And then, shortly after, Bran interacts with the past again, this time entering the weirwood by accident. Watching the flames, Bran decided he would stay awake till Mira came back. Jojen would be unhappy, he knew, but Mira would be glad for him. He did not remember closing his eyes. But then, somehow he was back at Winterfell again, in the godswood, looking down upon his father. Lord Eddard seemed much younger this time. His hair was brown with no hint of gray in it, his head bowed. Let them grow up close as brothers, with only love between them, he prayed, and let my lady wife find it in her heart to forgive. "Father!" Bran's voice was a whisper in the wind, a rustle in the leaves. "Father, it's me. It's Bran. Brandon." Eddard Stark lifted his head and looked long at the weirwood, frowning. But he did not speak. He cannot see me, Bran realized, despairing. He wanted to reach out and touch him, but all that he could do was watch and listen. Now, with both of these passages, there is some plausible deniability on the idea that Bran interacted with the past. Perhaps someone else called to Ned, causing him to hear something and turn. Perhaps Ned looked up and examined the weirwood with no real reason at that moment coincidentally. This is certainly the position of Bloodraven, who specifically says that interacting with the past is not possible. He heard a whisper on the wind, a rustling amongst the leaves. You cannot speak to him, try as you might. I know. I have my own ghosts, Bran. A brother that I loved, a brother that I hated, a woman I desired. Through the trees I see them still, but no word of mine has ever reached them. The past remains the past. We can learn from it, but we cannot change it. And because of this out, the prevailing opinion among fans after the release of A Dance with Dragons was that time travel, at least interactive time travel, wasn't actually happening. The argument essentially being that with regards to time travel, 1. Bloodraven said there wasn't, 2, the story was too crowded for such a plot point, and 3, it's a really dumb idea. Of course, these were rather bad arguments, as Bloodraven's evidence for there not being interactive time travel was his inability to affect change, something that Bran pretty much proved he could do. Additionally, our author loves cramming new stuff into an already crowded story, and finally, our author, like anyone else, is capable of a lot of great ideas as well as crappy ones that he sticks with for years despite no one liking them. Of course, everything changed in 2016. Interactive time travel was shown to exist in the Game of Thrones episode Hold the Door. Bran goes back in time to fry Hodor's brain, leading Hodor to have a life of being a simpleton and eventually perishing to buy Bran and Mira 15 minutes of lead time to escape some whites before Benjen saves them. The big deal with this episode actually came from the inside the episode afterwards, when David Benioff and Weiss said that the Hodor Hold the Door plot point specifically came from George R.R. Martin.
Probably the most shocking revelation he had for us was when he told us the origin of Hodor.
Even sitting in a hotel room and having somebody tell you that this was going to happen in the abstract in some way, and that Hold the Door was the origin of the name Hodor.
And so now we can say with near certainty that yes, time travel is part of the Ice and Fire story. It happened in Game of Thrones, and the showrunners said that it was taken from George R. R. Martin's plot points from the book. Ned did hear Bran after all. And it cannot be stressed enough what a big can of worms this is to open. Not just for the future of the story, but for the story we've already read. You see, if we accept that Bran can time travel and affect the past, who's to say that a future Bran hasn't already been affecting the story? Every weird dream, every spooky vision, every whispering werewood, every prophetic flame, every odd-behaving raven, everything that we suspect being orchestrated by a puppet master. When we speculate on who might be the culprit of these things, whether it be Quaithe or Marwyn or Bloodraven or the Green Men, who knows, how can we not include a time-traveling Bran as a potential manipulator? In particular, I'd like to bring up a couple of moments in our story that perhaps point to the influence of a time-traveling Bran. The first is an extremely odd scene from Jon 7, A Clash of Kings, when Jon, as Ghost, has a vision of a werewood. It seemed to sprout from solid rock, its pale roots twisting up from a myriad of fissures and hairline cracks. The tree was slender compared to other werewoods he had seen, no more than a sapling. Yet it was growing as he watched, its limbs thickening as they reached for the sky. Wary, he circled the smooth white trunk until he came to the face. Red eyes looked at him. Fierce eyes they were, yet glad to see him. The werewood had his brother's face. Had his brother always had 3 eyes? Not always, came the silent shout. Not before the crow. He sniffed at the bark, smelled wolf and tree and boy. But behind that were other scents. The rich brown smell of warm earth, and the hard gray smell of stone, and something else. Something terrible. Death, he knew. He was smelling death. He cringed back, his hair bristling, and bared his fangs. Don't be afraid. I like it in the dark. No one can see you, but you can see them. But first, you have to open your eyes. See? Like this. And the tree reached down and touched him. Now, I will say the brother in the tree is not named and could conceivably be Rickon, but in all probability it's Bran. And in Bran 7, A Clash of Kings, Bran does think about how he may have reached out to Ghost. We are clearly led to believe that the Ghost vision is sent by a contemporary Bran. Except, a contemporary Bran reaching out to Ghost doesn't actually make too much sense. Notably, the Bran in the vision says that he likes the dark, something that contemporary Bran is specifically conflicted on. In fact, later on in Bran 3, A Dance with Dragons, Bran is instructed not to fear the darkness, a lesson that would seem silly to a Bran who lost his fear of the dark back in A Clash of Kings. But a larger issue is that the Bran of the vision is trying to open Jon's third eye. Not only would a contemporary Bran have no pressing desire to open Jon's third eye, but a contemporary Bran wouldn't even know he had the ability to do such a thing. In Bran 7, Bran is hiding from the battle above in the crypts of Winterfell, and his third eye had just opened for himself, which he attributes to the darkness in the Winterfell crypts. It simply doesn't fit that a largely inexperienced Bran would suddenly visit ghosts north of the Wall manifesting as a weirwood sapling and try to open Jon's third eye. Why would he do that? And how would he do that? No, the Bran talking to ghosts was experienced, like how Bran would be in the future, which makes one wonder if this appearance was a time-traveling Bran. The second situation that needs to be brought up isn't an appearance of time-traveling Bran, but it certainly makes us wonder about the source of Bran's visions. "Are you the Three-Eyed Crow?" Bran heard himself say. A three-eyed crow should have 3 eyes. He has only one, and that one red. Bran could feel the eye staring at him, shining like a pool of blood in the torchlight. Where the other eye should have been, a thin white root grew from an empty socket, down his cheek and into his neck. "A crow?" The Pale Lord's voice was dry. His lips moved slowly, as if they had forgotten how to form words. "Once, I, black of garb and black of blood." The clothes he wore were rotten and faded, spotted with moss and eaten through with worms, but once they had been black. "I have been many things, Bran. Now I am as you see me, and now you will understand why I could not come to you, except in dreams. I have watched you for a long time, watched you with 1,000 eyes in one. I saw your birth, and that of your Lord Father before you. I saw your first step, heard your first word, was part of your first dream. I was watching when you fell, and now you are come to me at last, Brandon Stark, though the hour is late." Now, what is so striking about this passage is that Bloodraven doesn't seem to understand the question that Bran is asking. He thinks Bran is asking him if he was a brother of the Night's Watch, and not a literal black bird with feathers, which is clearly what Bran meant. Keep in mind, in Bran's first vision, whoever was talking to him took the form of a feathered crow. And Bran even asks that character if they are a crow. And this crow appears several times, not just in the dreams of Bran, but in the dreams of Jojen as well. It's rather odd that Bloodraven would not know that he is the Three-Eyed Crow. And it's worth noting that the Children of the Forest don't call Bloodraven the Three-Eyed Crow either. They call him the Greenseer. "He's waiting for you." "The Three-Eyed Crow?" asked Mira. "The Greenseer." The same is true of Cold Hands. He also never calls Bloodraven the Three-Eyed Crow. "Who sent you? Who is this Three-Eyed Crow?" "A friend, dreamer, wizard, call him what you will. The last Greenseer." Now, one could perhaps argue that Bloodraven's appearance is unconscious to him. Maybe he doesn't know that he takes the form of a crow. Except again, Bran specifically asks him in the first vision if he's a crow. So even if he doesn't see himself as a crow, he should know he's a crow from Bran. It's worth noting that the crow in the vision at least knows that it flies. Now, Bloodraven does specifically say that he was visiting Bran in dreams, but that doesn't mean he was necessarily part of all of Bran's dreams. Other non-crow related visions do come to Bran. Notably, a weirwood also calls to him, and sometimes the weirwood and the Three-Eyed Crow appear at the same time. Perhaps it's nothing, but the fact that Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest don't know the term Three-Eyed Crow is rather suspicious. Couple this with the fact that we know a time-traveling Bran is in our story, it makes us wonder if at least some of Bran's visions are actually from, well, Bran. And this would make the most sense. Think about it. Of all the people in the world that one could effectively manipulate, isn't oneself the easiest target? After all, one would know oneself's background and motivation. One would know how oneself would respond to stimuli. Or at least, one would know better than anyone else on the planet. Now, of course, future Bran interacting with himself or with anyone else in the past is a paradox. Time travel is always a paradox, and our author is well aware that time travel has this problem. George R.R. Martin has mused that time travel has been mislabeled as sci-fi in society, as it's completely fantastical, and when our author has written short stories about time travel, its paradoxical nature is highlighted. That said, we don't know which type of paradox Bran's time travel is. You see, time travel paradoxes come in 2 general varieties. There's the causal loop paradox, which is also called the bootstrap paradox or the predestination paradox, and the grandfather paradox. Let's start with the causal loop paradox. This is when something from the future goes back in time to influence an event in the past, which leads to the future happening, which in turn sends back the influencing event to influence the past, which leads to the future, and so on and so on. In popular culture, there is the example from The Terminator, where John Connor sends Kyle Reese back in time to hook up with his mom to produce John, who would grow up, and then send Kyle Reese back in time to hook up with his mom, and so on. The story of Oedipus is also an example of a causal loop, where Oedipus tries to prevent a prophecy, a vision from the future, from happening, only to cause the events to happen. In fact, all stories with unpreventable prophecies, including the Bible, would be causal loops. The events of the prophecies are predestined, and this is a rather important point that we will get back to. Anyway, what makes this a paradox is that the chain of cause and effect is circular. A cause leads to an effect which is its own cause, and the effect is caused ultimately by itself, which means it doesn't really have a root cause. Even if we forgive this circular reasoning for events happening, in a grander sense, there's still no reason for the loop to be there in the first place. So the second type of paradox is the grandfather paradox, which proposes a theoretical situation where one goes back in time and kills one's grandfather before he's able to sire one's father. If one's grandfather is dead, one cannot be born. However, if one isn't born, then there's no one to kill the grandfather, so the grandfather would be alive, which means one can be born, which means one can go back in time to kill one's grandfather, meaning one wouldn't be born, and so on and so on. The grandfather paradox is exceedingly difficult to adapt to a story as it contains contradictory events occurring simultaneously, a grandfather being dead and not dead, a killer being born and never born. We get something approaching the grandfather paradox in Back to the Future because Marty prevented his own birth by pushing his dad out of the way of a car, but if Marty disappeared, he would have never been able to push his dad out of the way, which means he would reappear, so he could push his dad out of the way, making him disappear, and so on and so on. Once you think about it, the story doesn't really make any sense. Whatever the case, what's important to note about the grandfather paradox is that it highlights that in a general sense, if time travel affects the past, then it ultimately affects the mechanism for time travel in the present, which in turn affects the past again. Essentially, if an element from the present is the causation for something in the past, then that element of causation will change. So we're essentially stuck with a paradox either way. Either time travel is a stable causal loop with causation coming out of nowhere, or it's an unstable grandfather paradox with continuously shifting causation. Now, different writers have tried to come up with different ways to solve these paradoxes, the most popular being the idea of branching timelines. But that doesn't really make any sense either. If something causes a new branching timeline and the old timeline ceases to exist, that would remove the cause. A view of history would show matter and causation popping literally out of nowhere to affect the world. When Marty, who grew up poor, created a new timeline, he was motivated by the fact that he was disappearing after pushing his dad. That was the driving cause of events. But his history was destroyed, and a new rich Marty was created in a branching timeline. So who on earth is trying to get Marty's parents together? Even if rich Marty miraculously managed to go back in time, which we appear to see, he would act completely differently as he knew a completely different set of parents and notably wouldn't see himself disappearing after pushing his dad. The causation of events would be utterly different and would unfold in a different manner. Now, as it turns out, George R.R. Martin does have a workaround for time travel paradoxes. I'm not saying it's a good or logical workaround, but he has one nonetheless. You see, George R.R. Martin has written 4 time-traveling stories, including Ice and Fire, and all 4 are similar in an important respect. Time travel in all of these stories is never an actual physical person or object traveling through time. Instead, it's always human consciousness time traveling. Time travel for George R. R. Martin is less like The Terminator and Back to the Future, and more like Groundhog's Day. Now, I have to say, consciousness time travel doesn't actually make any sense, as human memories take up actual space in the universe inside a physical human brain, but nonetheless, this is our author's go-to mechanism for storytelling. And according to his narratives, this effectively deals with the causation problems of the grandfather paradox. Essentially, according to George R. R. Martin, If one goes back in time and takes over someone else's mind, a decision can be altered, but the causation can be cleanly attributed to the seized mind. There's no physical objects popping out of nowhere, it's all murkily hidden in the mysterious realm of free will. For example, say one's consciousness goes back in time and makes a random dude kill one's grandfather. The grandfather dies and one ceases to exist, and that's it. When examining the timeline, it's the random dude who decided to kill one's grandfather. It's clean. I mean, not really, but according to George R.R. Martin's stories. Anyway, next time we will go into this in more detail. We will look at each of George R.R. Martin's time travel stories and what it means for the future of Ice and Fire. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.